Well, as Sylvia said, first of all, good morning. I guess I'm about the 17th person to say good morning to you this morning, but what an inspiration to have the Judith O'Connor scholars with us this morning. I have a very simple task this morning, and that is to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Jean Case, who runs the Case Foundation here in Washington, D.C., a foundation that was established in 1997 by she and her husband. And I think, as I was doing some research last night about Jean and about the foundation, I was really struck by their tagline. We talked yesterday about missions and how important standing up for your mission can be, and I'm sort of a mission geek. And I want to just read to you the tagline that the Case Foundation uses. They are investing in people and ideas that can change the world. People and ideas. That was really striking to me because in my day job, I run a foundation myself, the Surdna Foundation, and sometimes we forget that we're investing in people and ideas. We think we're investing in institutions, or we think we're investing in networks. We use all of these euphemisms, but really, ultimately, we're all investing in people. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we think about our own board service, and the Stand Up for Your Mission campaign that BoardSource and its partners launched yesterday is really all about you as individuals standing up for the causes that you, through you, your organizations stand for. And I really love that the Case Foundation, in the $100 million that they've invested in the world in the last 17 years, focuses on people and focuses on those people and their ideas, because ultimately that's what makes change. And I think as we listened to the Judith O'Connor scholars just a moment ago, they're the people. They're the next wave, and they have great ideas. And I'm really inspired that philanthropies like the Case Foundation are making investments in those kinds of people who ultimately are the change agents in a complex world. So this morning, as you'll see from the stage setup, we're going to do a slightly different format. We're not going to have a speech. We're going to have a conversation. And Jean will be joined on stage by Denise Grant. And Denise comes from Russell Reynolds, an executive search firm, a multifaceted firm that also does executive search. And Denise is the head of the CEO and Board Services division of Russell Reynolds and has worked really closely with Jean when Jean's wearing her other hat, which is that Jean also serves not only as the CEO of the Case Foundation, but on several boards. And Jean and Denise most recently worked on the CEO search for National Geographic. And I can tell from the conversation we were having backstage that they're bursting with excitement about talking with you about governance, and really they themselves understand the challenges and the successes that governance can bring for individuals and for organizations. So with that, I'm going to welcome Jean and Denise to the stage for a conversation that I hope you'll enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. We are excited to be here. We've been excited backstage, and it's fun to be on stage.
It is, and be excited about a topic like governance. I don't know. Phil, you may have...
First thing in the morning.
Oh, and wow, what a great group at 8 a.m. We understand you all had big festivities last night, so kudos to all of you for showing up this morning. So one thing we wanted to do before we started was to see kind of a raise of hands on how many of you are board members. Okay, great. And then how many of you all are management in organizations? Okay, so it's a great mix here then. Good. Well, we just wanted to know because we didn't want to talk about things that might not be of interest to one group or another, so we've got a good mix here.
I saw someone go like this, which sort of describes the difference between management and board, right?
Exactly. Jean, everybody's here because they are passionate about their organizations, their philanthropic organizations, nonprofit organizations, and making sure that they can do as much as they can to make sure that their organizations are having an impact and fulfilling their mission. And I know that's something that is near and dear to your heart, something that you've been focused on throughout your career, and especially through the Case Foundation most recently. A couple of years ago, you launched the Be Fearless campaign.
We did.
So talk a little bit about the campaign and why you launched that and what you thought the needs were, and why you thought there was a need for a fearless approach to change.
Sure. Well, let me say just a couple things as we kick off. You know, I'm so fortunate to have Denise Grant on stage with me, and when we called to talk about, what were some of the themes that we wanted to cover this morning, I told Denise, this interview could be the other way around. I think Denise is amazing in what she does. You heard that I had the privilege of working with her and helping to place the new CEO at National Geographic, but I've also worked with her on board work, and more importantly, just in the last year, Denise was responsible for the placement of the new Secretary of the Smithsonian, the new head of the Kennedy Center here in Washington, and leads so many of really outstanding institutions, both in their searches for new leadership and in their board work. So hopefully this is going to be more of a conversation than an interview, because I think you have a lot to bring, to the conversation as well through your extraordinary leadership in this. So thanks, Denise.
Thank you.
Also want to give a shout out to BoardSource, because we are going to talk about our Be Fearless campaign. But, we went through this Stand for Your Mission, and I know you guys talked about it some yesterday. I think it's really outstanding work, and just want to give BoardSource sort of some kudos for having us here this morning. And last but not least, we were saying we really want to give the audience kudos. Chances are the things we're going to talk about this morning, you guys don't need to hear, because there's 840 people who came to Washington to say, I want to be a better board member. And probably a lot of things we'll cover, really they're words needed for people who aren't here this morning. But we know you're change agents, and so hopefully we'll leave you with something valuable. But if it's okay, I'd love to tell the world that you're gathered here this morning just on the subject of helping nonprofit boards be awesome. So if I can, I'm going to take a little picture of the audience, because when I get off stage, I want to tweet about what you're doing here this morning. So can everybody just smile for me? All right. And turn your cell phones on and tweet, okay? Don't turn them off. Okay, Be Fearless. So what's that all about? Some of you may have heard of our Be Fearless campaign, and it sounds kind of cute, right? Be Fearless, sounds a little edgy, what's that all about? But actually, it really wasn't intended to be a campaign. When we celebrated our 15th anniversary at the Case Foundation, we really tried to use it as a moment of reflection, to basically stop, look around, look back, talk to our partners. Because what we realized is, in a lot of areas that we care about, and a lot of areas we've funded, and our partners work as well, in some cases, in fact, in most cases, we didn't see the progress that we had wanted to see. But in other cases, there was breakthrough transformation. And as we looked back and we talked to our partners, they told us the same thing. So at the 15th anniversary, we could have used it as a moment where we actually got a little bit depressed, like, are we making a difference? But instead, what we tried to do was say, well, let's go to school on where there has been breakthrough, and not just in our work, not just in our partners' work, but looking around and looking back. So we hired a firm, and they took a look at great movements and great organizations that found that special, unique, breakthrough, transformational kind of change that I think we all want to see in the work that we do and in the world around us. And so out of that, it was clear that there were a number of principles at work. And I'll cover them quickly, and we thought it would make a great frame for the conversation today, basically. But the first principle is make big bets and make history. And, that sounds really cute and everything, but at the end of the day, none of us in this room should want incremental change. We want to do big things. And for every organization and every leader, what the big bet is could be different, right? It doesn't mean that you have to have a global campaign. It doesn't mean that you have to move millions. But in your world, what's the big bet? And as we looked at the nonprofit, the public sector, and philanthropies, in some cases, we didn't see a swing for the fences kind of mentality. So if you're sitting on a board or you're leading a nonprofit, I want to start this morning by saying, what's your swing for the fences plan? If you don't have one, you're not going to achieve it, period. So we encourage organizations to think about that. The second principle is experiment early and often, and don't be afraid to go first. The world is disrupted. No matter who you are and what you're working on, the world is disrupted. And chances are your organization is as well. We're in desperate need of innovation. As I said, most of the things we've been working on, think about it, disease, poverty, et cetera, they're not in the shape today we want to see them. We need accelerated change. And to get that, we have to find innovation. And to find innovation, we got to try stuff. We have to experiment, and we have to take risks. And I want to pause on that because really I think risk is at the heart of our Be Fearless campaign. You simply can't innovate without taking risks. The third one is make failure matter. So why would we talk about failure? Because here's how it works. If you're going to innovate, you have to try new things and take risks. If you're going to try new things and take risks, you might fail. And accepting that, and as board members, giving the leadership and management air cover basically to take risks, to say we understand in this case we're going to try something that hasn't been tried, and we're going to have your back if it doesn't work. We're going to come right back. We're going to make failure matter. We're going to fail fast. We're going to fail forward. That's an important principle. The next one is reach beyond your bubble, asking the question, who's not at the table and whose voice that's important in your work are you not hearing? And we have lots of things I think that we want to talk about there. And the last principle is let urgency conquer fear. And, you know, I think about Rosa Parks when I think about that principle, because can you imagine what it must have felt like to her? And she wasn't running an organization, remember, she was one individual. But that one single act of letting urgency conquer fear changed this nation and probably the world for all time. And I think too often in the boardrooms I go into in the nonprofit sector, in management teams I work with, I don't feel that sense of urgency. And I was at a forum like this a year ago, and somebody said, the morning speaker said, I can tell when I'm in the nonprofit sector because people aren't talking as fast and they're not walking as fast. And boy, that really struck me. I mean, it's something you can kind of laugh about, but at the same time, we do need to act with urgency in everything that we're trying to do as we try to change the world. So that's roughly the Be Fearless frame, a little bit long, but that's I think those are some of the areas that we want to talk about in terms of, okay, so what does that mean now as boards and what we should be doing?
Right. A quick follow-up onto that. The Case Foundation's recently hit a milestone and over $100 million of investment. I know you always like to lead by example, Jean. So what's kind of some of what are some of the fearless things that you all have invested in that you've done?
Sure. Well, you know, the tagline was given earlier, we invest in people and ideas that can change the world. And I think it's a really great question for you to ask, Denise, because first of all, I have to say at the start, we're not perfect. We have a lot of great ideas, and a lot of the things that we'll talk about this morning that I think leaders have to do, you know, we're still trying to get it right ourselves. But one thing we are pretty good at now is understanding what we might call our unique value proposition, what we uniquely can do. And that's something, again, if you're serving on a board, are you asking, what's our unique value proposition? Not what's our business model, what do we do? It's how are we different and what can we uniquely deliver? And you know, we had talked about sort of the overlap that we see in the nonprofit sector too often. And I think if you constantly ask yourself how you're unique. So for us, one of the things we think that we do well is we look for transformational ideas around big initiatives, people and ideas, and we really try to leverage others. We try to bring new people to the table. We try to bring new capital to the table. So although our foundation has passed the 100 million milestone, actually that 100 million has easily leveraged $10 billion of investment. And so we count our own effectiveness not on what we spend or how big our staff is, but what can we unleash out in the world. And so through some major initiatives we've taken forward, ranging from the digital divide to one of our most recent ones called Startup America, to the new realm of impact investing, where just in June we got together with a group and released a report. I've served on a G8 advisory panel around impact investing, and with the release of that report at the White House, we brought $2 billion in new impact investing commitments to the table. So those are some examples of big initiatives that we've been involved in.
Jean, something that you and I have talked a lot about as well is the fact that nonprofit board service is a volunteer-based.
Right.
You're not getting paid, and it's a big time commitment. People have full-time jobs doing other things, so it's a big commitment. And also, as a part of that, sometimes when you have people that are volunteers, there can be a little bit of a risk aversion on the board. And how do you think about trying to make it a more comfortable environment for the debate and dialogue and for risk-taking?
Right.
I mean, we're not talking crazy risk-taking or
Right.
recklessness,
Measured
but
risk-taking.
measured risk-taking.
Yeah, and I want to say at the start, this risk-taking, it's going to look different for every leader and every organization. For some, it might be one thing that you identify in your business plan where you're going to try something new. For others, it might be 20% of your budget. We've seen some organizations that say, hey, we're all in. Case Foundation's mostly all in. We're catalyst investors. We try to, spur new things. But it's different. This risk scale is very, very different. But to your question about volunteers, I think one of the great challenges of foundations, nonprofits in the public sector is there's this sense that you're spending someone else's money or you're managing someone else's money. And I've often said, and we're fortunate, right, because we're what they call living donors. So the decisions we make and the risks we take at the Case Foundation, it's with our own money. That's pretty easy, actually. What's hard is when you step into the path of, okay, so let's say tomorrow, Denise, you say, okay, Jean, here's a pot of money. Will you manage this for me? Will you lead that effort? I can guarantee you I'm going to become more conservative in that role than I am in the role where it's my own money. But I actually would be doing a disservice at the end. Because, I think when we get into our conservative mode, if there was ever a time when a conservative mode was right, it is not today. I think the questions board members have to be asking of management and the questions management has to be managing to is really, what's around the corner? What aren't we doing? It isn't just sort of how do we limit what we do. It's really the bigger question of what should we be doing that we're not. And again, that's going to take experimentation and risk. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Instagram has come out of nowhere, huge phenom. And if you don't know it, you should. Let me just say that. And maybe some of your organizations should have a goal of where you want to be in terms of the number of Instagram followers you have. But Kodak could have been Instagram. AOL, a company I helped build, could have been Facebook. The threats to organizations and to leaders are often more around what you don't do than what you do that might be risky. And I just think as volunteers, as people, who come together really as good shepherds of an idea and of resources and of a leadership team, it's asking the questions about what can we do? It's playing attacker, not just defender. And I think if you think about your own role as a board member, and by the way, I want to go back and say I have to check myself on this all the time when I'm sitting in a boardroom. Am I playing defender, which I go to very comfortably, meaning, listening for why we shouldn't do that, or are we playing attacker a little bit, asking, hey, what are the big opportunities, and how do we go grab them? And I just think, with that mindset, I think we can sort of be in a better position in this disrupted world to make sure we're securing our organizations for the disruptors that might be out there and could unseat us.
Mm-hmm. And Jean, you've been on both sides of the equation. You've been a board member and you've been in management in the private sector and have a deep sensitivity and understanding for the difference between management and board. How would you advise people to think about, being more involved as board members, helping to encourage it, but at the same time not encroaching on management responsibilities?
It's such an important point, and I bet if we ask for a show of hands, which we won't, we might see a lot of hands if we asked two questions. How many think that the boards you serve on are in the weeds with management, too in the weeds? We might see a lot of hands. If we said, how many think the boards you serve on might be too detached, not connected enough to what really is going on. You know, going back to this, like really understanding the mission, really understanding the work that's supposed to be done, and the key areas affecting the organizations you serve. And so it's interesting to me, right? Because those are two really opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think, you know, the work we've been engaged in together with boards is to really try to figure out, how do you build a culture where there's open dialogue, where you're not so polite to one another, you know, where basically the important issues are put on the table and there's trust and comfort so that you can challenge things management or other board members put on the table, so that you can bring up the big radical ideas that maybe some people are afraid of. You know, I think that's sort of the sweet spot that we need to find for boards. And if you're here, you care deeply about making your board work excellent. And, you know, I think in most boards, and it's funny, I told Denise, when this was coming up, so I would say like for the last 4 to 6 weeks, there just isn't a leader I've talked to where I haven't sort of interviewed them to find out sort of where were they in their experience with nonprofit boards and corporate boards, by the way. And I would say the effective boards have said, we have been able to find that sweet spot where we can have those hard conversations, and the key content or nuggets of what has to come out is present at the board meeting. But the vast majority said, people are too polite. There isn't an open dialogue culture in the boardroom. People don't say what they really mean, or they are afraid to bring, you know, hard things forward. And I think in this one particular area, if we could make progress as a sector, I think it could really transform organizations and their missions.
And that is something that Jean and I have worked a lot on in certain areas, is board effectiveness. And I think, Jean, you really hit on a key nugget there. How would you recommend, what are some effective things that you've seen boards do to get past that? We're collaborative to a point because we almost too respectful, and we don't have open dialogue and discussion.
Right. So I think I used the term air cover before, and I think boards need air cover strategies. And what I mean by that is, you know, someone has to play the role. Someone has to say to the CEO, we're going to have a hard conversation. We've got your back, but we need to have open dialogue here. And management, often the CEO, you know, the air cover you need, tap 1 or 2 of the board members that you maybe know best or, you know, are most comfortable with, and ask them to be the one to actually bring up the hard things. So one of the things we've done at the Case Foundation, because I'm always concerned that, you know, we hear the things people don't want to tell us. And it's really hard sometimes to have your team tell you the things you don't want to hear. So what we've done in the past to make sure we're vetting that is we've assigned someone the task of being the antagonist. And it's helped enormously, because someone can come in and now they're unafraid, right? Because I've said to them, all right, your role in this is challenge us, bring up all the reasons either this doesn't make sense or other things we need to be thinking about. And it's funny how as soon as someone puts something out there, you see all the heads start to shake. But unless somebody was assigned to put it out there, it might never have been brought up. And so I think, you know, I think CEOs need air cover for things they want to put on, and, you know, the answer there is work with your board, 1 or 2 of them, and see if you can get someone to help lead that dialogue. And then boards need air cover with the CEO to say the hard things.
That's good. You know, we are at a time of great disruption, you know, just globally, our global economies. We've got so many big major issues around the world to solve. One of the key themes from Be Fearless that really speaks to me, and Jean knows exactly what I'm going to say, it's that, you know, it's comfortable to go it alone, but innovation happens at intersections. And I think that those are really important words and something we need to always think about. And it's very interesting, you know, Walter Isaacson's new book about the innovators. One of the key themes that hits you up front in his new book is collaborative creativity. And that innovation happens not in isolation, but in collaborations and in different forms. Jean, we've talked a lot about that, and I know you've got some very good thoughts on, you know, how can we start thinking? How do boards and nonprofits need to start thinking about collaboration and cross-sector? I mean, there's a tendency, I think, things are also so competitive. And we're competing for dollars, we're competing for time, we're competing to be more effective in a space. And sometimes what that can do is to make organizations retreat and want to do it on their own.
Right.
But where we're seeing more impact is really where there is this collaborative creativity.
Yeah.
Share with us some of your thoughts on that, Jean.
Sure. Well, we've actually used an African proverb in our Be Fearless work to talk about this collaboration, which is called reach beyond your bubble. And the proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you must go together. And I think the people in this room want to go fast and far. So there are some things that you can just do as an organization, head down, get it done, or as a management team. But generally speaking, I told the story of sort of what we've leveraged with our investments, really to make the point that when we think about the impact of our work, we don't think about our role. We think about what we have unleashed more broadly. And I would challenge all of you to ask this important question at the board table around collaboration. Because again, in the same way that we're all getting disrupted, we're all feeling a pressure around resources, not enough time, too big a challenge. What's the answer to that? Lock arms, okay? You know, think about a crew team. I mean, it takes many rowing together to go as fast and as far, and that's what you need to be as an organization. There are other organizations, other leaders you can collaborate with, other sectors. So at the Case Foundation, everything we do has to be cross-sector. So we have a corporate partner, we have a public sector partner, we have a nonprofit partner, and the really great thing in recent years is we have a lot of partners in philanthropy, where we're locking arms together and trying to do big things. And I can tell you, we could never have achieved the impacts we think that we've had in our work were it not for our partners. We give all credit to our partners. We're just not that good alone to have done what we've done. It's because we had the benefit of tapping partners. And Denise is so right. When I came out of the private sector and we started the foundation, I was stunned at the competitive nature of the nonprofit sector. But what I would say is not a healthy competitive nature. In business, I understood, trust me, we were viciously competitive, okay? But we knew when to collaborate on things where we had to go farther. And I did not see that present in the nonprofit sector. And I must say at the same time, I didn't see the donor group who was calling on the nonprofit sector to collaborate. But I've seen a lot of change on that front. I do believe much of the donor community now gets that we need to work together. I haven't seen the same change in the nonprofit sector. So I think we actually need more competition in the nonprofit sector, but not competition the way it happens today. Competition in asking that thing I brought up much earlier, what is our unique value proposition? And if you can actually arrive at an answer to that question, then you should be strong. But if you're sitting there and you're doing the same thing 10 other organizations are doing, and by the way, you're doing it the same way you've always done it and you haven't adapted to today's new world, then you're in a very, very vulnerable position. And you know, think about the board meetings you've been on. I'll only speak for my own that I sit on in the nonprofit sector. I never see a presentation on the competition. Just doesn't happen. It needs to happen. You need to understand the place in the world that you fit and how you stack up against others. It will keep you on your feet. It will keep you doing a better job at what you do and making sure you're adding unique value.
What are some of the learnings from the private sector? You mentioned competition and healthy competition. What are some other things, either both from private sector boards or just from the private sector in general? I mean, now granted, we all know the private sector does not know do everything right, and the private sector can learn a lot from the nonprofit sector and the social sector. But what are some of the things that we can learn from that are good learnings from the private sector?
So I think private sector boards have an advantage that nonprofit boards do not. And that is that even if they're slackers or they have a dysfunctional or say not effective board, there are disciplines that are transparent to measure how the organization is doing. So for public companies, there's a stock price. So let's say you're not paying attention as a board member. Well, trust me, that stock price starts to fall, you're going to start paying attention, okay? You know, in the private sector, you borrow money. You know, trust me, you start getting off your business model, the bank's going to be calling. I mean, there are just things that happen in the private sector outside of the boardroom that kind of have to keep the leaders in the guardrails. But what are you measuring as you think about the organizations that you serve on the board of? You know, what are the true north kind of things you have to be monitoring? And I want to say again, I have to ask myself this question all the time. I think it's really easy to get caught up in the everything's good and the CEO comes in and, you know, gives the good report and maybe runs the video and you leave going like this. But is there a dashboard? Because one thing I think the private sector does really well is understands the discipline of a dashboard, of really kind of always having on the table what are the key metrics we need to be paying attention to. And just making sure that, you know, in the board session, it's not just a feel-good thing, but we really are tracking a series of things that can define the health of an organization, or worse, the winds that are blowing out there.
And as you point out, you know, there are certain things that make public companies have to be more, boards
Right.
have to be effective, and obviously you've got the SEC and
Right.
governance requirements, et cetera. But we as members of nonprofit boards also have that obligation ourselves, even though we don't have a regulatory body telling us, we have a fiduciary
We do.
responsibility. How would you suggest those of us that are sitting on boards that may not be as effective as they should be, how can we as individuals of the board go about helping raise some of the issues and helping try to figure out how to make the board more effective?
Yeah. You know, and it goes back to an earlier question you asked too. I think there's a lot to be said for socialization. So and socialization of the board can take place in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to get really tactical here. But, you know, it took me a little while to figure out, actually to lift my head up and say, well, why does this board feel better than this board? And what are they doing that they're not doing, et cetera? I think socialization is really important. So I'll give you an example. On one of the boards I serve on, the CEO does a monthly call. And it's not required. Okay, the board meets every quarter. It's not required that board members be on the call, but I think I've made every call. And, you know, it's not easy, right? Because you have your calendars. But I have gained so much value by getting a monthly update from the CEO. And if you're a CEO, I would encourage you to think about, you know, maybe for you it's not monthly, but whatever it is, more routine communication between the CEO and his or her board. Having board dinners before the board meeting. You know, you drink a little wine together, and it can be kind of fun. In our work around failure, we do what's called liquid fail fests, because we found if we host fail fests at bars and we ask nonprofit leaders to tell their stories of failure, they get a little more honest when they've had a few glasses of wine. Imagine that. So I think that socialization, and actually for me in life generally, I think there's a power in breaking bread together. You know, it's almost an ancient kind of thing. And if you're not doing board dinners, there's an intimate, you know, I just had one night before last, and there's an intimacy that takes place at a dinner table that is often missing when you get under fluorescent lights in the light of day. So I think that's really important. The other thing I would add, you know, call your board. Call your board routinely, all right? If you're a board member, call other board members. Call your CEO. CEO, you should definitely be calling your board members on a routine basis. Sometimes, and Denise, I really should turn to you, we've seen that when you go one-on-one with a board member, that whole thing about polite dialogue can sometimes go out the window. I mean, what have you found on this front?
No, absolutely. And it's that getting to know one another and having that trust. Because the real discussion, the real important dialogue, pushing and pulling and thinking through, you know, what are both the opportunities and the risk, and let's figure out how to take these measured risks together, comes from the honesty and the trust, and having those interpersonal connections outside the board room are so important and so critical to that.
Yeah, I really think so. And you know, I asked Michael Dell this question. because I said I'm pretty much anyone who comes in front of me, and Michael's been a friend a long time, and I had occasion to be with him recently, and I don't know if you know the story of his company. He started it in his dorm room. It became a public company, and he has taken the company private, which is kind of a unique story. But I was asking him about both his board experiences at Dell and then his nonprofit board experiences. But he told me something at Dell that, boy, I really made a mental note of, and I've told some of the CEOs that I work with. He said he has board days once a year, and he invites board members to come in and choose where they want to spend time in the organization, totally up to them. He has no issue with you go where you want to go. Spend time with the management teams, and often these aren't necessarily the senior folks that they're used to seeing in the boardroom. And he said it has really done wonders. And I said, well, gosh, I would worry that would make board members get in the weeds, right? Which we always worry about in the job of management. And he said, not at all. I think they bring a much healthier understanding of our mission, of our challenges, of the talent of our team. So that's another way that somebody has sort of socialized the board more broadly around who they are as an organization and what they're trying to do. And I thought that was really effective.
Yeah, that is. I like that story. I like that story. Are we doing questions? Is that, and I was getting a signal, so
Okay.
I think that we're time to throw the floor open
Okay,
for some
great.
questions for Jean. Over here.
Hi. Good morning.
Good morning.
Really inspired by the conversation so far.
Thank you.
And I work in the private sector, and I'm board chair. And feels like there's a structural problem in the not-for-profit sector where we are underfunding research and development. And so in the private sector, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we move from here to here. In the not-for-profit sector, we're focused on current state, delivering the services from the donors that provide us the funding. How do we change that
Good question.
mindset, number one? Number two, how do we influence donors to take those risks to invest in the future state of not-for-profits? Thank you.
I love your question.
That's
Thank you
perfect.
for that. And you know what I love? That you called it R&D. I love that. Because I think, I'll throw this out there again. How many of you, you don't have to raise your hand, how many of you have heard R&D used as a concept? Now you might, of course, if you're in the scientific or medical side of things, but if you're really engaged in sort of human services, are you talking about R&D? And that R&D is what I call, experiment early and often, right? And I personally think these messages are as important for donors as they are for the organizations they support, because we do need donors to come in and say to the organizations, we want you to be trying new things, we want you to have R&D, and we will fund. And I actually believe that a lot of the foundations that I've talked to in the last year or two are really open to this idea. Look, they want the same things you guys want. They want to break through, and they know it's not happening. So we have to try something new in most cases, and many are willing to step up to the plate and fund. As a management team, or if you're a CEO sitting in the audience, I'm actually working with one of the CEOs of an organization I serve on the board on now, and I said to him, think about Google X, okay? Google takes 20% of its people's time and lets them work on what they want to work on. Over here, they have Google X. These are what they call moonshots, right? The chances of them actually being able to pull it off aren't great. But guess what? They're not betting the whole company on it. They've apportioned a certain amount of team and talent to Google X. What's your moonshot? What's your big bet? And then what do you need to put in place to basically make sure people are released from what you said, which is, head down, day-to-day delivery, and what does that look like for you? And then can you get that funded? Can you get your board to approve it? And if you're a board member, hopefully you'd be open to that. And then can you find funders? And there are funders. Literally, and I'm sure Denise's practice, if someone came to you and said, Denise, we don't really know where to go to find sort of out-of-the-box donors and philanthropies that will help us get this funded. Use an organization like Denise's or another one if you don't know a path to those kind of donors.
And I think, Jean, there's a good opportunity to put a plug in for the CASE Foundations. They've just released a Be Fearless framework for action, which I think it's a good, handy guide that you can use as board members. And actually, as you were posing that question, I thought this is a good thing, to take to donors, to help donors shift their framework, shift their mindset into how can we be thinking about investment and investment for the future and in this creative collaboration.
Right, and what we're doing there, thank you, Denise, for bringing that up. And it is casefoundation.org/BeFearless where you can find it. And we're introducing 6 case studies because too often we do sit with audiences this morning and they go, okay, but what do I do now? We also have a Be Fearless pledge, and over 25,000 leaders have taken the Be Fearless pledge. So if you kind of are thinking, maybe this is something you could socialize with your board or your management team, we invite you to check it out and look at the resources and tools that are there.
Another question? I see somebody over there.
I joined my first board at 23.
Wow.
Which was a long time ago, 43 years ago. So I've served on 38 boards and been president of 8. My question is...
Did you say 38 boards?
Yeah, but not
Whoa.
now. Yeah.
Hopefully not simultaneously.
Well, this is I'm old. It's been a long time. But my question is, how do you balance urgency and burnout? Because my contention, and you may disagree, is that we're running a marathon, not a sprint. And that sense of urgency, I'm seeing too many of the executive directors I work with working 70, 80, 90-hour weeks and burning out because they are running a sprint when they're trying to accomplish a marathon.
That's a really good question. You can probably tell me if you've been on 38 boards, I'm just saying. One way of looking at that is it's different talent, and it's sort of different people, if you will. So I don't actually think it's about the number of hours that you work. I think it's about how you structure your organization and the leadership around you to be both urgent and mindful of the everyday task in front of you. And, I think the kind of people that are really jazzed by, I have these 3 things to do today and I will feel great when that's done, might be a little different than the people who say, I can't sleep until I know, we've figured out a plan around this disruption that's coming. Or the kind of people that look around corners. Sometimes, think about, for instance, the difference between a CEO and a COO, right? The COO is really meant to be more head down operational. The CEO, head up. Look around corners, look out. And so I think maybe apportioning part of the team, and it kind of goes back to the R&D question a little bit, just being purposeful and intentional in saying there has to be a job of the urgency, of the avoiding disruption, of the looking at what we're not doing and should be doing. And, as leaders, you have to decide, is that a portion of your team, is that one, but make sure it's present somewhere in the organization.
Any more questions from the audience?
Yeah,
Saw
it's
another
kinda hard to
hand.
see.
I know
Can
it
you
is hard
see?
to see. There's a hand up right here in the middle. There's a hand over here I'm seeing. I guess I'm blinded by the lights. It's blue.
Hi, I'm just not familiar with the term air cover, so I'm wondering if you can describe that a little better.
Thank
Maybe I'm the
you.
only one, but
No, thank you. We're in Washington, and we're so guilty of using these acronyms and terms. Sorry for that, if that wasn't clear. Air cover just means protection, having someone's back, okay? So if you're going to take a risk in the boardroom or as a leader, what you really want to try to do is make sure you have buy-in and people around you who say, I have your back on that one. And that's what we mean by air cover. So obviously, if you're a CEO and you reach out to a couple of board members and you explain to them what you want to do and they say, I'm behind you, let those be the first voices in the boardroom. And, make sure they understand the risk you're going to take or the thing you're going to put on the table, and they say, I'm there for you.
We've got a question, somebody, a couple of hands over here. Right.
As a funder, do you, when you are supporting innovation with another organization, do you provide any supports, and how responsible do you feel for encouraging them to take risks that they may or may not have the capacity to take on?
That they may not have the
May or may not have the capacity to assume. I work with a funding organization, and we try to support collaborations and innovations that might extend an organization beyond their current footprint. And we feel some concern, responsibility for making sure we're not putting them in a precarious situation.
Absolutely. And I think what you might be touching on a little bit there is mission creep too, right? Which can happen, which is a terrible thing sometimes donors bring to an organization unintentionally. So I think when we talk about risk, we're talking about measured, calculated risk. And I think if you're asking the right questions and looking at the right issues as you're working with an organization or within your own organization, you should know what those look like. So, I wouldn't encourage donors to push an organization to take risks. They're not really set up to survive if it fails, okay? So I think this idea of what does measured risk look like to achieve innovation, and sometimes, it's the difference between jumping all in or doing a small pilot, or it's like what I said earlier. I'm pretty sure that no matter what organization you come from, what kind of teams you have, you can do one thing this year where you're trying something new. And obviously that something then has to be in that measured box. Like, what can we do that can advance the ball, that can, be strategic in our interests, but doesn't put the organization at risk? I don't know if that answers it, but we talk about these things in the framework and some of the tools that we have on the site, but this idea of risk, it's not, oh yeah, go take risks. It really is trying to be purposeful and intentional and understanding what are the things we have to measure as we make this decision around risk.
I think we maybe have time. They're telling us maybe time for one more question. Okay.
Hi. The perception is that philanthropists often are focused on the latest and greatest and the shiny new activity and cause. And there are a lot of organizations, YMCA, Salvation Army, Red Cross, and others that are established in their communities doing great work. Can you talk about maybe how you also look at the established terrain and bring them along to your future?
Sure. So I'm totally guilty of the shiny new only because we're catalyst investors. So we really are trying to find new ideas and new approaches and new leaders, basically, that we can back. That being said, we have backed many established organizations. So I think, what I'm seeing is a little bit of a division in the foundation world, that we're starting to see a class, and this goes to that class I referenced earlier, who I think would be willing to fund some R&D, some new experimentation, et cetera. And, they might be in that class of what you call shiny new. And I don't think it's just, I know that philanthropy has a bad rap for only going to stay with you a little while and then they're going to move on. I see a number of philanthropies that are doing the really hard work of helping organizations transform and be stronger in this current environment. Some of the organizations even that you just mentioned. And for us, we tried to demonstrate that we're not just going to be shiny new in one way that I'll share with you. We helped bring City Year to Washington, D.C., and I don't know how many of you know City Year. It's a really terrific organization, service organization engaging young people between the ages of 17 and 24 in a year of service, kind of like a gap year kind of thing. Although it's so diverse as a core that many of them haven't even graduated from high school. So right up to the valedictorian of the high school. So it's a really great thing. So we brought them to DC, I want to say maybe 1999. And we made a commitment to fund them, but our funding required them to grow their funding base. Not because we didn't want to keep giving them grants, it's because we knew they would be stronger if they had a larger base of supporters. And they did a really terrific job of that. But then what happened is we started asking about impact of the service, and there wasn't a good answer. And we said, all right, well, it's going to be hard to stay at the table if we don't feel like there's really impact, or what we would call ROI. So instead of walking away from them, we kind of rolled up our sleeves together, and they came up with sort of a reimagining of how they could add value in the service that they do in the city. And today, we couldn't feel better about the role of City Year and the impact they're having in our schools. And we've been funding them for 14 years, and they're, I think, the longest standing grantee that we have. We just made the decision this week we're going to fund them again. And the reason is we want to reward organizations that stay in the game and find a way to impact. We could have walked away. We could have walked away because they weren't shiny and new anymore, but we made the decision to stay at the table. And I see some peer organizations doing the same thing in the funding world, and obviously we need more of that.